Thank you, Dr. Kandagle, for that very nice introduction to the topic. And thank you, Pavitra, for organizing this talk. And also thanks to the Bangalore Life Science Cluster for thinking of this kind of a program to sort of engage faculties and expertise scattered over the country with each other. So, as you can see here, here is a bee sitting in a plastic chamber which we held, and then we are doing some behavioral as well as electrophysiology experiments with this bee. And so I'll try to introduce the context in which we carry out these experiments and maybe briefly on try to give a flavor of how we go about doing that. So you ask me questions in the middle also, because I'm not aware of the audience level exactly. So I can sort of uh, pace myself accordingly. Okay. So this is our lab. We do experiments and all, but we also have a lot of fun at other times. So I'll be talking generally about this kind of work, and also use some data from Shivraju here and Sandhya and Meenakshi uh, in this talk. Okay. So insects are very fascinating creatures, and from the talks available in the series on the website, I realized that a number of people have talked about insects already on at different levels, and I think this would be a little different perspective on the insects and their function. But however, the fascination about insects, I think, is quite universal, and to dwell on an insect, here is a potter wasp, which is building its nest in our university. So you can see it is handling a ball of mud and shaping it to a particular kind of size and shape and wall thickness and so on. So and it has to make this mud far away from this location that you are seeing where it is building the nest. And also it has to have water source to sort of make the mud to be of appropriate consistency. So you can imagine that the wasp has actually visited multiple places to acquire this ball of mud, and then it has to repeatedly get back to the same location, right, to build this home. So it must be using a lot of different kinds of sensors and processing in its brain to carry out this job, which quite often people think when they see insects that, okay, they are randomly moving around, and then they are maybe sensing certain particular source, maybe smell or temperature or sight of certain of colors, and then they are in the random from the random motion they move towards that particular location or move away if it is a threat, right? But here you can see it is not just about uh, randomly walking around. It has to go back and forth between a particular location in space. So it has to remember where it is. So all these capacities, which unless we carefully observe, we think are present only in higher systems like mammalian systems, are present in these lower, so-called lower organisms, right? So one of the quest is to figure out, okay, how these small insects, which have these small brains, carry out these kind of functions. Now, to basically sort of get a sense of the kind of sensory systems these insects have, of course, mammals have this binocular vision with a single lens on in each eye. And here is a spider which has multiple eyes looking in different directions. And here is an insect which has compound eye with each ommatidia looking in different direction. Okay, so it is looking in a large number of directions at the same time, right? So these are all but trying to acquire information about the outside world available in terms of photons arriving from those sites around them, right? Here is a auditory system of different organisms, and unlike eyes, which to some extent you can easily relate to how they look, the auditory system can actually look very different in different species. So, of course, in mammalian system, you have these two ears. Here is a cricket which receives auditory information through tympanum on its leg, which is shown here in the electron micrograph. And here is a picture of a mosquito, and it actually receives vibrations traveling through the air using its antennae, right? So vibrations traveling through the air, which is sound, is transduced into information inside the organism in very different ways. And insects have adapted these structures based on probably the kind of frequencies and the loudness of the sounds which it is to make use of. And here is a nose of a mammal. The nose of insects are in most cases are on this antennae. Okay, so the receptors of the which can sense the chemicals are present on this antennae. And this is a grasshopper, and this is a fly, and fly's antennae are here. And in the fly, there are olfactory receptor neurons even present in other parts of the body, okay, like the maxillary part. Now, when we look at these structures, there are two viewpoints from which we look at them. One is that they are all living in this world, and the to survive in this world, it has to deal with all of them have to deal with somewhat similar kinds of stimuli, right? Whether it's olfaction, the spectrum of the light, or the temperature range over which they have to survive, or the sound which can be carried through air. So all these are, of course, there are differences, and there's a fairly large range, but by and large, compared to the entire, hello, someone's mic.
Hi, sorry. I think a student had a question, so
Yeah,
raised her hand, but I can't hear her, so maybe she can put it in the Q&A box.
yeah, please do.
Okay, please continue.
Okay. Yeah, so they have to deal with the similar kind of, you can say, signals or stimuli of different modalities. So that is one aspect which is commonly shared by all organisms, whether it is uh, insects or unicellular organisms or mammals, right? And the other aspect is that these all have evolved from their ancestors, evolutionarily primitive systems, right? So that way there are similarities between them. So the similarities in the functioning of these systems arises from these two different reasons. One is they deal with same kind of similar kind of uh, uh, sensory modalities, and other is they have evolutionary history which is common, right? So these things we keep in mind when we look at these systems and try to explain why a particular system is functioning like this. Okay, so that has to be in the back of the mind all the time. Now here is so we talked about sensation and transduction and in some sense also memory, right? For example, the wasp has to remember where to collect and where to go to build its nest. Uh, Insects also exhibit communication in a fairly complicated way, not just chemical based communication, which we see in this kind of a uh, uh, social organism like bees, right? The wasp which I showed you was a solitary wasp, so there is no real social communication here. But so here is a vessel in which we have put some sugar, and you can see some bees here, right? And this picture was taken after quite some time, maybe almost 45 minutes. But when you started the uh, this system, it was sort of like this. So you can see here there were no bees, and this plate was kept at a distance from the hive. So you can see a bee is sort of flying in. Okay, now I'll wait for some time. Now you can see a couple of bees. Uh, right, then you wait for some more time. You can see maybe three, four bees, three bees. Then you wait for some more time. You see that there are four bees. You wait for some more time. You see there are fairly large number of bees there. And in around 45 minutes, you can see a huge number of bees there. And this is not the case that the bees are flying around this and randomly locating. This is quite far away from the hive. So these bees which have drunk the sugar have actually gone back to the hive and communicated somehow to the other bees that there is a sugar or food reward present in a particular direction at a particular distance away from the hive. So and now from Carl von Frisch work, we know that this is communicated to other bees through a particular language which is called a dance language. So this tiny insect brain actually does all this complicated task, right? So one of the uh, uh, questions we ask, or the main theme is to try and figure out in our own little way, little progress in trying to understand this system. Okay, a large number of labs all around the world are trying to solve little chunks of these problems, to which eventually we hope will give us a bigger understanding of this system. Yeah, by the end it is like full of bees. Okay, okay. Now, independent of whether you are looking inside a human brain or whether you are looking inside an insect brain, okay, and this is a human brain which shows the density of the brain matter, and this is a insect brain. This is one half of it, and basically showing what's called a synaptic density. Some of you may understand, some of you may not, but you imagine that this is some kind of structural difference within the brain. So you can see immediately there are different kinds of densities of in the different parts of the brain. But no matter either this brain or this brain, when you go look closer at maybe magnification of the order of 100, you will definitely see these specialized cells called neurons, which most of you by now would have learned about in your school or in your college. And all of you probably also know that these neurons are specialized cells which have these uh, structures which are elongated extensions of the cell membrane, which in general can be called as neurites. And maybe in some cases you can identify certain neurites to be of specialized in receiving information, and in some other cases you can uh, think that the neurites are actually sending or carrying information from the neuron to faraway neurons or faraway locations. So here are what you would commonly call as dendrite, and here are branches of what you would commonly call as axons, right? So the neuron transmits the information. That information proceeds through the axons and reaches the other neurons. So, and then they release certain chemicals from at these terminals here. So this is the zoomed version of this terminal, and these chemicals will in turn message the postsynaptic neuron. So this structure is called the synapse, and the postsynaptic neuron will get the message, and it in turn will carry the not just carry, it actually computes something, okay, and decides on certain aspects of the stimuli or the information which was received, and then may communicate to other cells by these kind of signals. So this is signal over time, okay, and you for now you only have to understand that these events which you can see as vertical fluctuations in the electrical signal, which is communicated through these branches, are a sort of units of communication, you can say. So if there are more of them, then the signal is strongly sending messages to the postsynaptic cell. If there are very few of them, weakly sending message. And if there are no spikes, then which these units are, then you would say there are no messages being passed. So you can see here, I have indicated here a location where some kind of stimulus or activity took place. And then during that time, this particular neuron messaged the postsynaptic neuron strongly. That's what you would infer from such a picture. Okay. I will show you how this recordings takes place a little later. Okay. For now, you understand that neurons are making up the brains, and neurons, network of neurons communicate with each other through these structures called synapse. And accents maybe may not be present. Sometimes, in general, you would call it neurite. Sometimes you can identify certain neurites to be accent, but this need not be true for all the neurons present in the brain. Okay. Now, coming to how human brain looks. So, because this is a brain surgery, I have sort of removed the color so that maybe it doesn't look gory. So, a neurosurgeon is doing brain surgery in a human being, and you can see the gyri and sulci of the human brain here. Right now, this often is carried out because the patient is needing certain parts of the brain to be removed. Right now, either because you got a person who's got a tumor or a cancer, or maybe has an epilepsy generated at certain parts of the brain. Now, how does the doctor decide that, okay, it is, we need to remove certain parts, but you have to be careful, and sometimes you have a compromise to be made, whether the disease is okay, or it is okay to leave the person certain part intact, because the person's identity itself and faculty like language, motor function, all are sort of carried out or driven by systems inside this brain. So though I want to remove this area because it's got tumor, if this area is involved in certain faculty, let's say for example comprehension or even the sense of self, then you wouldn't want to go and mess with that area. So how does the doctor know that, okay, this particular area in this particular patient, though there are commonalities across patients, the micro areas which specialize in certain aspects can be different from patient to patient. So the doctor has to figure out, okay, which area is corresponding to that faculty in this, or this area, is it okay to cut out? So what the doctor does is something called Penfield stimulation, which was discovered by this or used extensively by this doctor scientist called Penfield. So he takes an electric probe and activates the neurons here and see, for example, whether the patient has problem in comprehending or performing a task. So in these kind of cases, when you do brain surgery, the patient is actually not given general anesthesia, maybe some local anesthesia to make sure that uh, the incisions are not felt, but the patient is fully conscious and can do tasks like playing a violin because this particular patient is a musician, or the doctor is having a conversation with this person, or when the stimulus is given, sometimes you feel that this a particular hand is being touched or leg is being touched. So what I want to say is that there are neurons which when activated gives the sensations to the person, right? Not only that, uh, we know that if there is a compromise in a particular faculty, like speech comprehension, when a particular area is activated, you know that that particular area is carrying out that task. So the point is that there are neurons or areas of the brain which are carrying out certain tasks or representing certain information about certain perceptions, right? And this view in general is called representationist view. And this gives us hope that, okay, if you monitor the activity of the neurons or parts of the brain, we can probably try and get some understanding of how the brain uh, instantiates all these behaviors and perception, right? So that is a general view of, that's why we think we can make progress by studying brain to understand how the organism carries out behavior and have perception. Now, this may not be understood by many people, but that's okay. For those who understand, here is a brain, here is one neuron, if you zoom into it, and inside the neuron is, and outside the neuron, there are different kinds of ions, right? And I told about electrical signals being generated and transmitted through the neurons. They are actually sort of uh, made functional by ions, they are charged particles which can move across the membrane and also travel through the within the cell. Okay, and they move across the membrane through special structures called channels. So opening and closing of channels which allow certain kinds of ions to go through them, the meaning across the membrane, is what makes the electrical potential inside the cell change, maybe to increase or decrease. And that's how we see this fluctuation of electrical potentials, which we call the spike. Okay, because some ions have moved across this membrane, and that can propagate through these terminals to reach faraway location. Okay, this kind of electrical potential, and they are in the range of millivolt. Okay, so we only need to understand to that extent. So the idea is ions can move across membrane, and they move through these channels, and the channels may actually open or close to allow certain ions to go through based on the condition. For example, maybe this is a membrane and sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron is supposed to sense, say, olfactory sense. Then whenever olfactory molecule go and bind to these channels, it may open and allow ions to go through and changes the potential across the neuron membrane and generates these kind of spikes which will propagate to the further neurons. Okay, so the transduction of sensory information and also the communication between the neurons are all mediated by electrical charges going across the membrane and propagating through the neurons. Okay, and this is to show that whenever a presynaptic neuron, the neuron which is transmitting information, is receiving the electrical signal at its axon terminal, it will communicate to the postsynaptic neuron by this releasing this neurotransmitters stored in certain kinds of vesicles. Okay. Now, to sort of get a perspective on what it means to sense something, right? I would like to use this particular example. So, all of you must have used some kind of pain balm, be it Vicks or Amrutanjin or Tiger Balm or whatever, right? And also, many of you use mint, uh, either in sweets or in this kind of lozenges, right? And you would have observed that when you do use either of them, you would feel a sensation of cold if wind blows over it, or just when you apply or you taste this uh, uh, sweet, right? Mint sweet. So why do you think that happens, right? So sometimes people think that's because these things evaporate and cool down the surface. But actually, nothing really happens in terms of temperature on your surface of the skin when you apply the balm. What really happens is this: there are sensory neurons on your arm, say here, and if you zoom into it, you see some sort of neurons, okay, sitting inside here. And these neurons, if you zoom into this, you will see those kind of membranes with channels on them. And when you actually apply, so in the normal situation, these channels are closed, and these channels are such a way that when the cold is applied, they will open. These things will open, and some ions will move in, and that causes electrical signals to actually go through to your brain, okay, through the nerves. So, which means this neuron gets activated by cold. Now, it so happens that this there are molecules which can actually go and bind to these channels and open it and allow the same ions to go through, which means if I know this molecule, then I can actually open these channels and make this neuron send signal to the brain. And it so happens that the menthol present in these balms as well as in the mint lozenges are a particular kind of molecules which can actually open these cold sensors. So though the temperature doesn't change, you see that these neurons can be activated by this chemical, and independent of whether it is activated by chemical or by cold, for us it doesn't make a difference, right? We feel cold. So This is to say, to reinforce the representationist view that which neurons are activated is what makes us feel or perceive something or make us do something. And here is a measurement which people have carried out by recording from these neurons. And what I mean by recording, I will show a little later. So you can actually measure the potential of inside this neuron. And here is such a measurement in this cold sensing neuron. And what do you observe? If you apply, of course, lower the temperature, this gets activated. But even if the temperature is normal, if you apply menthol, which is what is present in the balm, these same neurons get activated, which means this activation of this neuron is what is important. And you will see when I say activation, it means activation from this neuron propagating and connecting to the appropriate location in the brain. Okay, that is what makes us feel the cold. So you can imagine that suppose you knew which neurons in the brain has to be activated to feel the cold, you don't even need to use menthol. You can probably directly go and activate those neurons and you may actually feel cold. Okay, so that's really the basic notion with which we proceed in understanding brain. Okay. Now, this kind of understanding has come from studies over many years. Okay, and these techniques which we use, especially the ones which we use in the lab, most of them are over 100 years old. And they are not very complicated techniques or very expensive technique to run, but strangely in our country there are very few labs which use them. Okay, so there is a lot of scope for people who are interested in this kind of work to actually uh, start this. So there are people who first identified that there are electrical signals which makes the animals behave. Then there are people who traced the neurons and Carl, who traced out neurons and identified the connectivity between neurons. Then there are people who looked at the behavior of the bees and so, for example, showed that okay, bees can learn and communicate with each other, like Carl Tonfish. Then there are people who actually developed and established the how electrical signals are generated and propagated inside the neurons, like Hodgkin and Huxley. Then people found there are people who, okay, these neurons are functioning like this, but what causes these neurons to, or the brain to actually remember things, and what's the mechanisms underlying that. And so there are people who looked at it, for example, like Eric Kandel, who studied it, how memory is formed using aplysia. There's a slug. And then there are, by the way, this neuron was also functioning was also understood using a small crustacean neuron, okay, or so a squid neuron, in this case, a squid neuron. Okay. While the network inside the brain, how they different functioning of the network can be controlled by chemicals, was studied by people like Eve Marder. Okay, so a lot of people have contributed to the fundamental understanding or how many stuff functions at its basic level, and we are using these information which has developed over the years to further our understanding on the systems. Okay, so and these are just few of them. Okay, a huge number of people have worked whose work on which we depend to move forward. And coming to the kind of stuff we do in our lab, as I said, this is how our kind of lab would have looked 100 years back. Okay, so this is Joseph A. Wrangler, who actually is uh, uh, sitting and recording from a certain system, a particular kind of neuron. Okay, and currently our lab would look sort of like this. Okay, and certain things I would like you to pay attention to. Here is this copper meshed cage. And okay, so all our electrical recordings we do inside this cage, and this cage is grounded. So to say, like your electric ground, right, in your 3-pin plug. And that is to make sure that the electrical signals, other than the ones which you are recording from the insect, is actually recorded through our recording system. Okay, at the point of recording. Of course, we monitor the signal in this kind of oscilloscope. We had to probably amplify the signal. So we have some amplifiers. And of course, we have to store these signals recorded on the computer, right? So we have a computer system. Then we also have to manipulate. So these neurons are very tiny structures, so microns or submicron structures. So, and we cannot use hands to move around in that kind of a fine precision. So we actually have fine micro manipulators controlled from outside the cage to move the electrodes to the appropriate location. Okay, so this is how the standard electrophysiology lab would look. Okay, and often this thing is called a ring. That's the common slang inside electrophysiology literature. Okay, so this is the manipulator. This is a microscope under which we look at the brain. Okay. Now, but though it looked quite complicated, the basic recording system is sort of like what you would use in your computer or mobile phone, right? You must have recorded a speech of somebody and looked at the speech or looked at the music, right, as shown here, for which you would have used a microphone plugged into your computer or your mobile phone. So microphone can be directly used and get stored in the computer. So here the microphone picks up the and converts the sound pressure into electrical signal. While in the case of neurons, they are by themselves electrical signal. We just need to collect that and then feed it into such amplifiers inside the computer. That's what this system does. Okay, this system that we showed here, though it looks elaborate, fundamentally there is nothing very different from this amplifier. Okay, and in fact, we can use this kind of system to actually record from the neuron. Actually, this is a recording of neuron using this kind of a setup, which we carried out in our lab. Okay, so it's in principle to understand the principle is not very difficult. Okay, of the recording, and to schematically represent what it means. So here is a glass electrode, and so it's a glass electrode because inside the cell is the solution, and outside is the solution, and this is the insulating cell membrane. So we have to pick up the signal from inside the neuron, right? So we need somehow go inside the neuron without disrupting the cell membrane much. So what we do is you take a glass capillary and then we heat it here and then pull it to either side. Then you will see that you can pull and make very sharp tips. Okay. Okay, and then if you fill this tip with the solution, which is of the same kind as inside the cell, then through the small hole, ions can move back and forth. So you can actually conduct from inside the cell through the saline to some electrode and amplify the signal and record. Okay, so that's what we do in our lab. And but to do that, we need to actually open up the head of the insect, in this case grasshopper, and then expose the brain and record. To sort of get a sense of how we go about it, I'll show you a small video clip. Okay. Yeah, so here is a grasshopper under the microscope. To start off with, you can see two antennae, two eyes, right? And we sort of make sure the head cannot move. So we immobilize the head. Then we build a wax cup around the head to hold the saline, because once you open up the head, the brain is exposed. It has to be immersed in the saline. And this butterfly-shaped structure is the brain. So now we have opened up and you are looking through the microscope onto the brain. Okay. And then that was a grasshopper brain. And if you do another insect, for example, this is a honeybee, and one half of the honeybee brain is exposed here, and it is having very similar architecture. So if you're familiar with one insect brain, then it's easy for you to discover the structure and do experiments on another insect brain. Okay, and so that's a honeybee brain. And so then we take it under this ring. Okay, everything is set up, everything is turned on. Okay, and so this is how it would look. So here I have placed the grasshopper with its wax cup, and saline is being supplied. And you can already see I have put one electrode in, going into the saline at least. And you will see now me inserting another electrode. Okay, so you can see I have moved the micromanipulator holder, and you can see now I am slightly moving the micromanipulator using this turn. You can see it's moving. Okay, I have to take out and then use that glass capillary. That's why I inserted my glass capillary. And then I use the micromanipulator to position the electrode into the saline, right? So that's what you usually do for placing the electrode at the appropriate location within the brain. Now I'll show you how it looks through the microscope. So if you see here, you can see here that this is the brain, and you can see two electrodes going into two different locations in the brain, right? And here is a wire which acts as the reference electrode with respect to which you measure the potential of what is there in these electrodes. So if the electrode is inside the cell, then you will pick up the potential of inside of the cell with respect to the outside point. You can see these antennae are kept intact. Wax cup is there, it is filled with saline, and the brain is sort of held up by certain platforms so that there is no movement. So we have to make sure the brain is not moving with respect to the electrode at all, if possible. So because the the neuron dimension is micrometers. So if the brain moves even by a micrometer, then recording electrode will go out of the particular neuron you are recording from. Okay. So are things okay so far? You can. Okay. Yeah, so this is schematic of how it is. So I have put two kinds of electrodes here. This is through which the saline will perfuse the brain. And here, of course, I have put a tube to apply olfactory stimulus in this case. Sometimes we do visual stimulus, sometimes we do olfactory stimulus. Any questions? Are things okay? Am I too simple, or is it too much over the head? Okay. I'm assuming it is okay. Okay, and then when we are recording here, sometimes we want to actually visualize the neurons morphology that we are recording from. So you can see here, if you look at this magnification, you can't see any neurons. Even if I magnify, it's not easy to see the full morphology of the neuron because they are densely packed inside this brain, right? But somehow I have recorded from a neuron, and I want to really look at the morphology of the neuron, and even sometimes look at what kind of chemicals are present, neurotransmitters are present in the neuron. So to do that, what we do is, while we are recording, we'll put a little, I don't know how this is slightly shifted. So this should be here. So we fill the pipette tip with some kind of dye before we put it into the brain. Okay, so if you do that, okay, and then after recording the potential, we will actually inject using some kind of either pressure or electrical current, we'll inject dye into the cell. So then the cell will completely get filled with this dye. Okay. And then when we take out the brain, and we can take out under microscopes which can image these colors, okay, which are these colors are called fluorophores, and we can get pictures like this. So here is an example of a neuron from which we recorded from, and you can see all these neurites of this particular neuron, and you can see, okay, this neuron I recorded from innervated this part, and here and so on, and its cell body is located here. Right? We can figure all this out, and this blue is a sort of visualization of certain uh, structures within the brain using using a kind of antibody reaction. Some of you may not be familiar with it. That is okay. So you can imagine that we can identify the parts of the brain using some markers. And in red is actually a chemical reaction which was carried out on this brain after the recording, of course, to which will bind certain colors to a particular chemical present there. In this case, I have looked at a chemical called GABA, which is a neurotransmitter. So, which you can see that this part is actually both a sort of yellow, not fully green, partly because this is also expressing this neurotransmitter GABA. So it is both red and green. That's why you can see slight yellow color here. Okay, so that way we know this particular neuron from which I recorded is morphology is this, and it is also expressing this particular neurotransmitter, and it is going here and there. So we know this must be connecting these two parts. Okay, so that's how we go about looking into the structures within the brain to figure out, okay, what this neuron might be doing. Okay. There are a large variety of recordings that we can carry out, not just this kind. And I will try to show you a particular recording from a visual pathway. This recording was carried out by my student Shivraju. So actually, there is a mobile phone here, and it's actually electrically insulated using some transparent but conducting sheets and so on. And it's under the grasshopper will sit here, and then grasshopper's eye will be looking onto the screen, and there will be some videos depending on what kind of stimulus. And here are some example snapshots of the stimuli that the grasshopper will see in this recording. And so I'll show you a video. Okay, somebody has a question here. How long would the neurons remain active for the experiment after being exposed and electrodes inserted into them? Yeah. So this is a common question. It actually depends on the animal and the kind of exposure you have done. If you are using insects and exposed like the way I have shown, it will stay after opening up the brain and perfusion. It will stay alive. You can have recording. Sometimes it go for hours. So I have recorded cells overnight. For example, I have impaled today, and then I came back tomorrow morning, and the cell is still being recorded. And there are other kinds of recordings where you can actually put wires which will get implanted inside the brain, and you can then cover the cuticle. It's not having certain kinds of possibilities. You cannot inject dye and so on, but those recordings can sometimes go over days. Yeah, so it depends on the animal, the size, the brain size, the motion of the brain, and uh, the particular system also, right? For example, bees die more easily compared to grasshoppers, right? So if you want to look at particular phenomena which requires longer recordings, then maybe you will choose grasshopper system. But grasshoppers don't learn well. So if you want to look at systems which you want to address questions regarding learning, then you look at honeybee or other kinds of bees which are good at learning. Yeah, so there are a lot of compromises and trade-offs which you use to decide on which animals to choose. And by and large, they can at least be recorded for hours. Okay? So I hope that answers the question. So so I was looking at telling about the visual stimulus. So here is a video of what the grasshopper will see. So here is a mobile phone. Grasshopper is here, and the grasshopper will see what is played on this mobile phone because it is facing the grasshopper. Okay, so you can see video is being played on the. You can see that's a looming stimulus. There's a loom out stimulus. These are some gratings and moving gratings. Okay, and then sometimes we apply natural stimulus. Right, those are naturally the videos, the kind of scenes the grasshopper may encounter when it is flying around in the grass. Okay, so we have these particular kinds of stimulus. Now I'll show you. So the Shivraju had an electrode impaled in the visual pathway in this particular grasshopper. Okay, and so in the next video I'll show you how that particular neuron responded to this particular kind of stimuli. Okay, so you can actually see, and I think if you have audio you can hear the so actually this is how we look from outside. Okay, this is how the uh, video will look from the outside. We are having a way by which we can transmit whatever happening on the mobile phone onto the recording computer, and we can see the neurons response on the top. Okay, but so this is how it looks as for the experimenter while the recording is going on. Now after recording we can actually make a nice video of how this neuron responded. So on the left side you will see what the grasshopper is seeing, and on the right side you will see how the neuron responded. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to play that video so you can observe. Sorry. I think that okay. Yeah, so this flickering pattern you're seeing is something called white noise. And so because we want to do white noise analysis. Yeah, so you could have figured out by now that the particular neuron responded in a particular way to different kinds of stimuli. Okay, so then of course, if the neuron is a feature detector, which is looking out, which will through the network which is connected to it, is actually looking at a particular computing and trying to detect a particular feature, then it would have responded vigorously to that feature, right? So through this white noise analysis, we sort of try to figure out what it is trying to do and so on. Okay? There's some mathematics behind it which you can learn. So this is if you record from other neurons connected to it, and we know how the connectivity is, then we can try to figure out how is it that that particular neuronal circuit you can enable this neuron to detect that particular feature. And so these are the kind of questions we ask. Okay, how does this neuron is responding to what? How is it that the neuron can respond to that particular kind of stimuli and not to others? This is the very simplest form in which that question is posed. Okay. Is it clear? Any questions?
There's a question.
Okay, let me see the
Uh,
chat. I think I removed
Suhas
it.
asked,
Ah,
during the experiment, did you show the grasshopper a predator?
so if you noticed in the video here, there is this calots in one of the clips within the video. And so we have a, a calot colored stuff, but doesn't look like calots. And then it changes to calots at some point in time. It also has similar grasshopper inside here, which has some grasshopper colored stuff, and then suddenly it becomes grasshopper, right? So we have such stimuli. So we often have limitations in terms of reliably being recording and then injecting dye. So there are only certain number of uh, uh, stimuli that you can apply in certain kinds of recordings. Okay. Yeah, so that is about visual system. Okay, now we also work on olfactory system in our lab, and to get a sense of what olfaction means, and of everybody knows that a hound or a dog can smell very well and go and find food by using its olfactory senses. And recently, Sobel's group, a few maybe 10 years back, showed that even human beings can actually track in the very same way as hounds. Okay. Only difference is that you have to make sure the human being also get close to the smell, just like dogs are. Dogs also put their nose where the smell is. If you make the human beings do that, they can also track smells fairly well, not like what we usually think about ourselves. And if you look at how a moth detects order to find its mate, so mate is the female moth is emitting some pheromone, and here is a trajectory of a male moth, okay, flying towards the female moth. And you can see that it has the similar kind of casting behavior or go in and out of the plume, just like you would see with all these animals. So it seems to be to track olfactory stimuli, you need to do this kind of uh, uh, go along, then if you deviate, you take a turn and come back and so on. Okay, so it seems to have very similar scheme in the brain doing the tracking. Now, if it is a human being, we can ask, okay, what was the smell? Could you recognize the smell, and so on? Or if it is smell to which an animal has an innate behavior, then you can, okay, animal can smell because, or it may be another stimulus, whatever be the stimulus. When we try to do experiment with animals, the first problem is we don't even know the animal is perceiving the stimulus, right? So if it is an innate behavior to a particular stimulus, then maybe you can figure out. This you might have encountered. So if you are on a road and some animal is standing in the road, then you honk sometimes, and you would see that the animal doesn't care. right? Because and then we doubt, okay, can it hear my sound? Maybe that frequency it cannot hear, right? So this question is even more severe in the case of insects, right? So how do we know that the animal even hears or sees something if it does not have a response which we can recognize immediately? And so in those cases, we usually try to do a certain trick with the animal, which is to actually innately maybe the animal does not have a response to that, but maybe if we associate that stimulus with a particular kind of stimulus for which the animal has an innate response, then maybe we can figure out if the animal can smell or see the particular thing. And maybe everybody knows about the Pavlov's dog, right? Pavlov's dog, right? You ring a bell and then you give food to the dog, and if you do it few times, then uh, the when the bell is rung, the dog will salivate, indicating that it is expecting a food. From which often the experiment is said as if, okay, dogs can learn to associate. That's what how the usually the experiment is portrayed in the literature. But if you think a little back, you should also realize that when the bell was rung, normally the dog was not really giving any response. So you don't even know that dog could hear the bell, right? So though sometimes it is used to see whether the animal can learn and study the learning mechanisms, it is often also a technique used to figure out whether this animal can actually hear or sense a particular stimulus, right? And similarly for the bees also, we can train the bees to associate with a certain stimulus. So if you take a bee and if you take a little sugar on a toothpick and touch the antenna or the proboscis, the bee will extend its proboscis to drink the sugar. Okay, so that's an innate response the bee has. Okay, so innate. Okay. Now, and usually if there is an order which we apply without any reward, then you will find that the bee does not do anything. Okay, so that particular order, we don't even know that the bee can smell or not. But suppose just like the Pavlov's dog experiment, we do the following. We apply the order, and overlapping with the order, at some point we give sugar to the bee. And we repeat this maybe 3 times or 4 times. Okay. Thereafter, you apply order only. You don't give any sugar. You will see that the bee actually extend proboscis expecting sugar, from which we learn 2 things. One is that bee can actually associate order with reward. The other thing is that you also realize the bee can actually smell that order, right? Of course, if the bee does not learn, we can't be sure that order cannot be smelled, right? But if it's definitely response, then we know, okay, it can smell the order. Now, this paradigm has been used to understand the phenomenon of learning and the nature of learning in animals. And this particular learning is called classical conditioning. A lot of understanding about classical conditioning has come from studying the honeybees. Okay, I'll show you the response of a bee after it has learned. Okay, so here is a light here, and usually in the normal experiment, the bee does not see the light. It's only the experimenter who sees. Just for the sake of the video, I am showing you the light as well. So you will see that where the light will change to one color, it will come on with a particular color, and during that time, the order is being presented. And at some point, it will change color, and that time sucrose comes on. Okay, then the order goes off. So if the bee has learned, you should see that the bee will extend the proboscis before it is given the sucrose. Okay, yeah, so that's what you should see. Yeah, so you can see here light is here, it is off. The order should come through this. Bee is not extending proboscis currently. Now, when this light comes on first, before the sucrose is applied, you should see the proboscis comes on. Okay, that's what we are watching out for, because it's a bee which has already learned. See, now it has already extended the proboscis, and I am still not giving the sugar. See, now only I am giving the sugar. Okay, so which means that the bee extended the proboscis before the order before the sugar came on, which means the bee has already associated that order with reward. Okay, so this is how we carry out the learning experiment. In this particular experiment, I was also the student. This recording was carried out by Bandita, and she was also recording from the brain. Okay, so yeah, that I'm not discussing in this. Okay, so this is how efficient the bees are. Okay, so here is the first time the order was applied, and none of the bees responded. Okay, this is the fraction of the bees learned. By the time third time the order is applied, even before the sucrose is presented, around 80-90% of the bees will extend the proboscis, just like you saw in the video. Okay, they will stabilize even if you repeat it. Okay, and after it has learned, you can wait for 3 hours or 24 hours and so on, and you will see that a fraction of the bees will still remember. 3 hours, almost all of them will still retain the memory. At 24 hours, still much more than the baseline. There will be quite a number of bees who will remember that this association has taken place. Okay, so this is how we interrogate the animal's learning system. Is this clear? Okay, I hope. Yeah. Now, using the system, we look. I'll try to tell how a particular behavioral experiment was carried out to answer certain questions in our lab. So here is the olfactory system of uh, rats, and in the rats, actually the olfactory system is such a way that just like us, if I ask you the question, okay, you close one ear, and in the other ear I tell you something, okay, some keyword I give you, so it has not been heard by the other side of the brain, at least not through that ear, right? Now you close the ear in which you were told that keyword, and in the other ear you are asked what was the keyword which I told you. Then all of you would have no hesitation in telling that, oh, I'll be able to tell, because whatever I heard it through one ear, I can always recall from the other ear as well, other side of the brain as well. Correct? Now, in the case of olfaction, suppose the animal smells through one nose, whether that information is available through the other nose or other side of the brain, right? Then that question has been asked in mammalian systems, and in mammalian system, the answer is that if the rat, for example, in which the question is asked, is adult, then it can immediately know on the other side. Okay, but if the the rat is young, then it cannot know on the other side, which means during the development, some connections are developing between the two sides of the brain, which enable this information to be transferred to the other side. But it is also interesting to note that in the rats, if you take a pup, you present the order on one side, and of course, it is not recalling on the other side. But you will see that after it has developed, the same pup has developed, now the information is available on the other side, which means that information stored on one side is accessible from the other side after the connection has been developed, though actually connection was not required at the time of the learning or time of the experience, right? Now, if you take the insect brain, actually most insect brains, except for some exceptions like Drosophila, you find that there is no reported connection between the two sides. This is the way people think brain is two halves disconnected. Oh, actually, this is slightly badly presented. In the Drosophila, actually, these two antenna lobes are connected. But in none of the other systems, we know of connection between the olfactory pathways of the two sides. So you would think that in such a brain, maybe if the animal is exposed to this kind of learning, the PER conditioning, only using one antenna, then maybe it's not accessible on the other side. Meaning if I train with one antenna open while other antenna is covered, but then I test the bee with the other antenna, but this antenna closed, then maybe it will not be able to recall, right? And this is the circuitry of the insect olfactory pathway, which many people have over the years have discovered. And in our lab, we also have characterized all these neurons in this grasshopper system. Shilpi, one of my PhD students, have done this work. And she also discovered that there are a class of neurons which actually connect the two sides of the brain. Inside this first time we are seeing a connection between the two sides of the olfactory pathway. Okay, and they are actually connecting the memory centers of the olfactory memory centers of the two sides. Okay, so okay, that means there is some connection existing. This is no more separate. That means there is now connection between the two sides of the brain. So then we can ask this question whether can this animal use this connection to actually transfer the information that olfactory information it has learned on one side to the other side. Okay. So another student, Meenakshi, and along with Sandhya, who actually characterized the olfactory system in other Indian bee. Most of the work on bees has been carried out using the Western bees, mostly in Europe and US and Japan. They used Apis mellifera. So we, for the first time, standardized the Apis dorsata, the rock bee, which you see hanging on trees and buildings all around India and Southern Asia. We characterized that olfactory pathway and standardized the system to learn just like Apis mellifera. So we have been doing experiment with these bees because they are a little more robust compared to the Apis mellifera in our hands. So using this bee as well as mellifera, we tested this particular hypothesis, which is that so there is a bee. In some bees, both antenna is covered, and we train the bees. Obviously, if the antenna is covered and it cannot smell, which means that if you train them, bees will not learn, right? In another set of bees, what we do is when we train, this antenna is open, this antenna is closed, right? But when we test, this antenna is closed and this antenna is open. So if the bee can actually transfer the information from this side learned to the other side, then in the bee which is tested on the other side, they should be able to recall, and recall meaning it should extend proboscis to that trained order. But when we do the experiment, hoping from our grasshopper result that there are the connection between the two sides, the bee learns with one antenna open, but when we test with the other side, they don't recall, which means there is hardly any information transfer between the two sides. At least the learned information is not transferred to the other side of the brain in bees. Now you may think, okay, maybe if you learn from on one side, then maybe it is forgetting on that side because it is only learned with one antenna and not with the two antenna, which usually enables it to stir at least more than store it more at least more than 3 hours, right? So we tested that. Is it because of loss of memory in 3 hours? That's not the case. If you use one antenna, they learn and they retain the memory for 3 hours. If you, of course, train the bees with two antenna, more bees but learn definitely, and they remember also equally well again in 3 hours, which means the memory of the bee uh, which has learned is not forgotten on the trained side, but it is not able to transfer that memory onto the other side, right? So we were a little disappointed, but that's where sort of what we discovered. So it looks like in the bee, or maybe more generally maybe in other insects too, information learned on one side, olfactory information, nothing to do with any other modality, is not transferable to the other side. Okay. Yeah, so that's sort of an example of how, okay, we have an electrophysiology and anatomy result, and we try to test the consequence of that kind of a structure for information transfer in an organism. So like that, there are a large number of questions which are present, mysteries which are present in the insect brain, from which these learnings also enable us to extrapolate to other systems. So as I said, most of the old discoveries were done, none of them in human beings or mammalian system. They were all done in lower invertebrates. Okay, whether be it functioning of a single neuron or uh, uh, learning or memory mechanisms or so on. So it's a very good model system in that way to explore the neural mechanisms and information processing in the brain, and how it will enable behavior. So I think I will stop now and take questions if any.